glad to be here and have enjoyed thoroughly the things that have gone on here Friday night, yesterday. I have lived for the last few years in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Its only claim to fame is the grave of Billy the Kid. And I was telling some of the people that the sign says Billy the Kid and so much more. I haven't found the so much more yet, but we do have some wonderful people in our little congregation there. Is a blessing to serve. It's made up mostly of ranchers who have ranches not counted in acres but in sections. But we're in a 100-year drought. It's good to see some green over here, because we sure don't have much in New Mexico. This morning, I want to draw your attention to one of my favorite chapters in the New Testament. One that I'm sure you know and love also, Romans chapter 12. You probably recognize quickly that this is one of those passages that talks about the church being a body. It's not like a body, it is a body. Jesus is the head. We're all members of it, subject to him, members of one another. There are 4 of these spiritual gift passages in the New Testament. Each one has its own unique contribution. Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, and 1 Peter 4. This one talks specifically, I think, about why we do what we do and why we are the way we are. Some of the passages talk more about the manifestational gifts that were somewhat common in the early church. Some of them stress specific ministries, but Romans 12 in a sense is the most basic of all, because again it discusses our basic motivations and how we do things and why we do things. Let's begin reading in the first verse, and I'm reading from the English Standard Version this morning. It may be a little different than what most of you have, but I think you can follow along. Romans 12:1. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Having gifts that differ, according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, in our serving. The one who teaches in his teaching. The one who exhorts in his exhortation. The one who contributes in generosity. The one who leads with zeal. And the one who does acts of mercy with cheerfulness. We could keep going, but that's more than enough for us to think about this morning. And we're not going to get into it very deeply, but hopefully the things that we do look at will be helpful to everyone here. That's my goal, and that's my prayer. There's some interesting words here that are interrelated. I'm not a Greek scholar, and I don't usually even try to get into the biblical languages, but there's some significance in some words here. First of all, we're going to have a little Greek lesson. First of all, the Greek word for joy. Now, every teenage boy here knows this. If any of you want to speak up and tell us. The Greek word for joy is car. It's spelled a little differently than our automobiles. It's C-H-A-R. So that word's in here. Paul is wanting his brothers and sisters in Christ to have joy in their Christian service. You take the word car and add a couple of letters, and you get the word charis. C-H-A-R-I-S. Well, that's the word for grace. And then you take that word, and that word's in here. Well, then you take that word and add a couple more letters, and you get the word charisma. And that's the word for gift. So I really believe that what Paul is talking about here is central to our faith, and that he's actually saying that our joy is fulfilled when we use the gifts that God has given us by his grace. Grace is used in the New Testament not only to talk about how we're saved, but also used to talk about how we live and how we're motivated to live as Christians. By the grace of God, I am what I am, is a way that it's used in that latter sense. This passage actually talks about 7 different charisma, spiritual gifts. It has nothing to do with the manifestational. It's not mysterious. It's not talking about tongue speaking or healing or anything of that matter. These things here are very basic. These are the kinds of things that Paul mentions that he's thankful for, and that he's more thankful for even than he is the manifestations that he has. Because these have to do with power, these have to do with energy, these have to do with motivation. And so this morning, for just a few minutes, we want to talk about how God has blessed each one of us as a member of his body that has a unique function, and how being what God has made us to be, doing what God has made us to do, is one of the most fulfilling and joyous things that can happen. But there are a couple of, well, there is a warning here. And the warning is, let's not think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. Don't you think more highly of yourself than you should. I don't want to think more highly of myself than I should. Well, what does that mean in this context? There are people who think they're better than anybody. There are people who boast. There are people who are filled with pride. And that is a turnoff to most of us, probably. Certainly in Scripture, humility is exalted, and pride is warned about. So when Paul says, don't think more highly of yourselves than you should, is he speaking of someone who is boastful and proud and a braggart? I'm a Texan. That's almost a definition of Texan. Is that what he's warning about? Well, no, not here. When he says here, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, he's talking about something very specific. And I'd like to explain that to you as I understand it by using a little personal illustration. I was born and raised in Texas. I have lived from coast to coast, from the state of Washington to North Carolina. My wife was from Washington State. There are a lot of areas of this great country that I love, and I had a wonderful experience in Oklahoma preaching for a few years up in Stillwater. But my second home, of all the places I've lived and loved, my first home is Central Texas. My second home is a town in the center of the state of Washington named Wenatchee. Wenatchee is right in the center. It's halfway between Spokane in the east and Seattle in the west. It's situated on the mighty Columbia River, which in that particular area is, there are great hydroelectric plants every 20 miles, and there's one in Wenatchee and one just south of Wenatchee. And Wenatchee is the apple capital of the world. So when you go east, you're in wonderful wheat fields and what's called the Palouse country all the way in the northern Idaho. Whenever you go west, though, you come to the Cascades. Beautiful mountains, snow-covered the year round, and Wenatchee is right there on the seam, on the Columbia, with all the orchards up and down the rivers, wheat fields to the east, and mountains, and then the coast to the west. Well, I've lived there 2 different times, worked with the church there 2 different times. And then my parents moved there after my father retired in Fort Worth. So it really is a second home to me. I love the area, I love the people there. The first time I moved there, some years ago, I began meeting the people in the congregation and the people in the community. And one of the first people I met was a woman named Edith. Edith was a school teacher. She had never married. She was very dedicated to the Lord and very, very active in the church. She did just about everything. She taught Bible classes. She visited the sick. She visited the nursing home. She was just an encourager. And when we had potlucks, she baked the best lemon pies you could ever imagine eating. Well, she was just a marvel. So one day I decided to go visit with her in her home and tell her how much I appreciated her and so on. She was very gracious, and I started thanking her for all the things that I knew she was doing. But she didn't smile. And I kept talking, but the more I talked, the sadder she looked. And then she actually began to cry, and I thought, I misspoke somehow. What did I say that's upsetting to her? What did I say? What's she feeling? What's she going through? And she was very sad, and I apologized. I said, did I say something wrong? What are you facing? What are you feeling right now? And she said, well, you're telling about all that I do, but the fact is, I don't think I do nearly enough. And she said, in fact, I'm not even sure I'm saved. And it was a surprise to me, and I wanted to listen and hear where she was coming from. And so she began telling me how that when she was preparing for her Bible class, that she would feel guilty because she knew there were people in the hospital that need to be visited, and she hasn't been today. And then when she would go to the hospital to visit those people, she would think about somebody in the nursing home that she missed 2 days ago when she was there, and how she needed to go see them. And the more she talked, the more amazed I was, because as much as she didn't feel she was doing nearly enough, and she didn't find joy in what she was doing. And I began realizing that she had fallen into the trap that Paul warns about here. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. See, this is not talking about being pompous. This is not talking about someone who is a braggart. This is talking about someone who is trying to be the whole body. Don't think more highly of yourself than you should. Each one of you is a member. And God has given you a gift by His grace that you are to utilize, and that should bring joy. Well, it was a real eye-opener for me, and I talked to our elders about it, and they went to see her one by one and as a group, and studied with her this whole concept that none of us is the whole body. I don't know this congregation. I know a lot of wonderful things about it. But I know that in most congregations there are 1 or 2 or 8 or 10 very dedicated people who really love the Lord and really love the church, but they try to be the whole body. That's a temptation, and it becomes a burden, and it's unnecessary. Because in being members one of another, thankfully, I don't have to do it all, and neither do you. When I was growing up in Fort Worth, occasionally there would be a day designated as a work day to work on the building. And a certain group would show up. And everybody didn't come, but there were those who did, and they did great things. But then on some other day, there would be an announcement that we were going to get out and knock doors or share faith with people. And again, certain people would show up. Then we would ask for volunteers to sing at the nursing home. Certain people would show up. There's a temptation for those who show up at the workday to wonder why everybody's not there. I'm here. Isn't everybody else concerned about our property like I am? And those who are evangelists and those who sing at the nursing home, see, there's a temptation there for us whenever we do something and others don't do it. There's a temptation to be judgmental. There's also the temptation to feel guilty if we don't do it. And I just wonder how much of that is completely unnecessary based on Romans 12. And let me just say right up front here that I'm not this morning trying to help anybody have excuses. But the fact is, no one of us is the whole body. If you had a football team and the running back is supposed to run and do some blocking and maybe occasionally some catching, we wouldn't expect them then to play defense as well as offense. Not these days. In a team, different people have different responsibilities. And we don't expect the quarterback to do the same things that a guard does, or the center to do the same things that a running back does. Because we're a team. And that team concept has become very much in our way of thinking because we like sports so much in this country. But if anything, the body illustration is even stronger. Because, well, my father-in-law, until he was 70 years old, he was quite an athlete and gymnast in his day. Until he was in his 70s, he could walk on his hands. It was amazing. But that isn't the way he normally walked. Or the way we expect people to walk. The fact that he could do it for a few seconds was great. But our hands are not generally for the purpose of walking on. Our feet are. Now when the feet can't do it, then we have a problem that we have to compensate for somehow. But we think nothing of the fact that in our bodies, different parts have different functions, and they all work together. When one part hurts, the whole body hurts. And so that very illustration is carried over. It was such a joy to see Edith realize that she wasn't the whole body. And she didn't become inactive by any means. But she started, and she lived in the apple capital of the world. And the thing you do in January and February in apple country, even though it's still cold and there may be snow on the ground, you prune. Because you don't have those orchards to grow leaves and branches. You have those orchards to bear fruit. And if you don't prune, the trees will get bigger and bigger, and you'll have a lot more leaves and branches, but you'll have a lot less fruit. I've seen them prune fruit trees to the point that, kind of like grape vineyards, it looks like they're killing them. But they're not. They're just pruning in order to bear fruit. I'm afraid that in some of our experiences, at least in mine, we haven't understood the concept of pruning. And we've just felt the need to do more and more and more and more, and so people burn out, people give up, people get bitter, and there are all sorts of things that happen. When if we just realize that none of us is the body, each one of us is a vital part. And my part may seem quite small, but at the same time, it's still vital. Let it go undone and see what happens. We're all a part of the body, but we need to be satisfied with that. And when we are, we actually find joy, because we're doing what God enabled us to do. And there are people who are not good soul winners. And there are people who are not good plumbers. Everybody thinks they can paint, but that's not true. There are a lot of people who mean well and try to paint, but they're not good painters. But that's okay. Because again, we're not trying to get out of anything. We want to be effective. We want to work together. And I know with my kids, they can do things I can't do. Well, I'm thankful for that. I'm not jealous of them. And I don't feel the need to apologize to them. I'm thankful for what they can do that I can't do. And there are things that I can do that they can't do. Well, that's okay. And certainly in the body of Christ, that's the way it is. Well, that comes out of this passage. Well, let me tell you about another person I met in Wenatchee. Can't quite see that clock. Is it 9:30? Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay. I liked Edith, and I liked virtually everybody in the church. But there were one or two I didn't care for. In fact, there was one I couldn't stand. I didn't like the way this guy looked. I didn't like anything about him. Every time I saw him, I thought to myself, oh no. I felt guilty about it, but I'm just telling you the truth. That's what it was. His name was Ralph Johnson. And I'll tell you why I didn't like him. He was the fella who counted on Sunday mornings. And it was not the fact that he counted, but the way he counted. When I got up to preach, he got up to count. And we had about 300 people on the average Sunday morning. And we had a sort of a fan-shaped auditorium at that time, and there were 4 or 5 aisles. So when I got up to preach, Ralph got up to count. Now he started in the back. I could see him. Others weren't looking at him. But he didn't go like this. He had one of those clickers. You know what I'm talking about? A little metal gadget. And so he kept it in his pocket, but you could hear it. And so he would start down one aisle. Click, 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 click. Every person got 2 clicks. So 300 people got 600 clicks. So when he got down that aisle, he would come around in the front and then go up this aisle, click, 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 and then he'd come back down, and it would take him 5 minutes or more. Well, this was when I was trying to begin my sermon, and I'd work on my introduction. I wanted to get everybody's attention, and I knew nobody was even hearing me. They were all watching Ralph and listening to him. Well, the fact is, I was the only one doing it. They just were used to it, but it irritated me no end. And I just thought, he doesn't have to do that. That's very disruptive. So I brought it up at the elders meeting. We had 4 wonderful elders, and I said, yeah, I've got, anybody got anything else? Yeah. Ralph Johnson. Oh, I didn't tell you. When Ralph got through counting, he left. He went out the back door. And I never saw him again till next Sunday morning. And then he was always there. But he'd count and he'd leave. And it was so frustrating to me. And I just said to the elders, can't you do something about the way Ralph counts? And one of them said, have you been to see him? And I said, no. And they said, well, you need to go talk to him. We're just glad he does that, and we can't get him to do anything else. And we'd hate to lose him. So then I thought, well, we've not only got a problem with Ralph, we've got weak elders. You know, I'm a brash, young guy. Well, it just went on. I kept getting irritated. Finally, one day, I just thought I had to go see him. And I asked the church secretary, Lucille, I said, does Ralph Johnson work in town? What does he do? Would he be available, you think? And she said, oh yeah, he works right downtown. He's there all the time. He's at the Apple Commission. Well, Wenatchee is the apple capital of the world. And the Washington State Apple Commission is the advertising agency that advertises. Whatever you know about Washington apples, it's because of the Washington State Apple Commission. You may not know that, but they're a huge advertising agency that takes up a full block in downtown Wenatchee. And that's where Ralph worked. So I decided to go see him and just confront him. So I walked in the front door of this place. It's a full block. Here's a secretary, a receptionist, and I said, is Ralph Johnson here? And she said, yes. May I see him? Do you have an appointment? No, I'm sorry, I don't. I began feeling a little uneasy because she seemed surprised that anybody would just walk in off the street and ask to see him. So she picked up the phone and she said, there's a gentleman here to see you, Mr. Johnson. Will you see him? And she looked surprised. And she put the phone down and she said, he'll see you. Okay. So she led me down this corridor, into another. We went into the bowels of this big complex, deeper and deeper, and I'm feeling more and more unsure. And finally we come to his office, and Ralph Johnson was the president of the Washington State Apple Commission. He's the reason people know about Washington apples. He was one of the top advertising people in the world. I didn't know any of that. So he opened the door, and we come into an office that I'll declare looked like this auditorium. I mean, it was big. And on the walls were pictures of Ralph Johnson shaking hands with the last 5 presidents, I mean of the United States. And there are plaques, and there are awards, and here's this huge desk, and Brother Johnson comes around and he says, "Brother Shotwell, to what do I owe this privilege?" Well, I'm not proud of it, but I lied. I said, "Brother Johnson, I don't know where this came from. Since you know so much about advertising, I just wanted to talk to you about what we can do to advertise the church more." And he said, "Well, I'd be delighted to help. Sit down." So I sat down in this beautiful side chair, and he took a yellow pad, and he said, "Now exactly what would you like to promote?" And I said, "Well, this is such a beautiful area, and we need more Christians, and I'd really like to know how we can get more Christians in other parts of the country to move to Washington to strengthen the churches here." He said, "Well, that's a good challenge." So he said, "What's the biggest meeting of our folks?" Well, at that time, it was the Abilene Christian University lectureship. So that's what I told him. He said, "When is that?" And at that time, it was in February every year. He said, "How many come to that?" And I guessed so many thousand. I wasn't sure. He said, "Do they have a display area?" I said, "Oh yeah, they've got a big display area." He said, "Well, that's where we'll start." So he picked up the phone, and he called somebody that turned out to be in San Diego, California. And he told me while he was waiting, he said, "These are the best display builders in the United States." Okay? So he called them and he said, "We have a big international meeting in February in Texas, and we want to put up a display there." He said, "I assume their spots are 8 feet long." He said, "We'll take 3. So we want a 24-foot display. And we want bells and whistles. We want full color. We want everything. We want this to be the most noticeable display in that whole event. This is a non-profit group. You would donate that, wouldn't you?" And whoever it was said, "Yes, of course." So then he said, so then he dialed another number, and he said, "I'm calling Olympia." That's the state capital. And he called the governor. And he said to the governor, "We've got this wonderful meeting in Texas, and we're going to get a lot of very capable folks to move out here to God's country. And so anything you can do to help us would be appreciated." So the governor wrote a letter, and he had his people give us brochures and lists of jobs all over the state and all sorts of stuff. And of course it was all donated. And then Ralph said, "How are we going to get everybody's attention?" Well, then he had called Abilene and reserved the space. I forgot that. Well, then he said, "We need to get everybody's attention. We're going to have competition there." He said, "I know, we'll give them apples." So he called somebody else and he said, "We have this great meeting in Texas, and we need 50,000 apples." He said, "I'd like 25,000 reds and 25,000 goldens." He said, "I'd like the goldens to be size 50 and the reds to be size 62. And I'd like them to come from orchards in Monitor, because that's the very best section around Wenatchee, is the town of Monitor, Washington." And he said, "You would donate those, wouldn't you?" And whoever it was said, "Yes, of course." So then he got a truck line to take them free. And I'm sitting there thinking, we've got this man counting. Our sign was a disgrace. In fact, half of it had fallen on the ground. It was at an angle like that. The paint was peeling off. Our bulletin was a disgrace. And we had this guy counting. So the last thing he said, Well, he said, I need to make one more call, and I never knew who he called, but he called somebody in the congregation, and he said, we're going to have this wonderful display at the Abilene Lectures in February, and Brother Shotwell and his wife and the elders and their wives need to go. You would pay their way, wouldn't you? And whoever it was said, of course. So when the time came, we all flew down. When we walked in there, the display was already set up. I never did know who set it up. The apples came in, the aroma filled that whole place. And we actually convinced dozens of people to move to the state of Washington. And most of them and their kids and grandkids are still there. And several of them are elders. And it just was a turning point for the church in the Northwest. And Ralph Johnson came up with it like that, as though he'd been planning this. So I thanked him and left. Feeling very guilty, not knowing what to say. And my guilt just ate me for days and days. And finally, I went back one day to apologize. And I made an appointment. And so he welcomed me again just as graciously. And he said, when you came down to see me that day, you weren't really wanting to talk about the Abilene Lectures, were you? And I said, no. He said, did it have to do with the way I count? I said, yes. And he said, I really need to apologize. He said, I need to apologize to you and to the whole church. He said, that's been very petty what I've done. He said, frankly, I have felt very neglected. I have felt there was so much that I could do, but I was never asked to do it. And so that's just been sort of my protest. And he said, that's really wrong on my part. And he said, would you pray with me to ask God's forgiveness for my pettiness? So we prayed for Ralph's pettiness and for my lying. And we became fast friends. And he became so active in so many ways. He's with the Lord. But what a blessing Ralph Johnson became to the church and to me personally. But he was kind of the opposite of Edith. Edith thought she had to do it all and couldn't. And he thought he had to be asked. And the elders thought they had asked him again and again, and he said no. So they were missing each other in communication. But this passage, Romans 12, turned those two individuals around. Turned me around. Turned the elders around. And blessed that great church, which has continued to be a great church and is a great church to this day. There are not only Edith Johnsons here and there in congregations. There are Ralph Johnsons. Her name was Johnson too, but they actually weren't related. There's Ralph Johnsons. Some of them are women. Some are men who are very talented, but who usually end up utilizing their talents for the Rotary Club or for the hospital or for, some civic organization. And they're needed in the body. We went through a whole study in that church, and the elders themselves began a study of what their own gifts were. Ralph had the gift of administration, there was no doubt. I didn't, and none of the elders did, but that didn't mean we couldn't serve the Lord, because again, this isn't looking for excuses. It's simply whatever we can do in the Lord, do well, and I know my time is gone. I just wanted to point you to this passage today and challenge you to get into it. I know that, I believe that in Pure Heart Ministries there are some things that may happen in the future where you're looking at this concept more specifically. and trying to help people. See, I happen to believe that one of the great tasks of leaders in the church, be they elders or staffs or parents, is to help people find their place in the body. Because a lot of people don't know, and they feel guilty because they can't do some things that they feel that everybody ought to do. Well, there is a sense that all of us do these things, but they're certainly not the things that are our primary, where our real strengths are. We tend to talk more in terms of talent. Well, this person has a talent for this or a talent for that. Let's get more biblical and call those things gifts. Because I believe God has enabled me to do some things that He wants me to do, and when I do them, it's satisfying, it's fulfilling, it's energizing. But then there are some other things that others do better, and I need to be able to let them do it and not feel guilty and not resent them. And if there happens to be an Edith here today or a Ralph, I hope this is helpful to you. Because Edith found joy in the Lord that she'd never known before. And so did Ralph. And it was all a matter of recognizing that I am a member of this body. And God put me here, and God enables me to do certain things. And thankfully, I'm the part of a great body. And there are other people with other strengths and doing other things and other gifts. And we work together. We help each other. We encourage one another. We're not jealous of each other. We're not competing with each other. And it's all a part of God's great scheme. You pray with me, please. Oh, Lord, you are the head of the body. None of us is. Even those who are elders or preachers, we're members of your body. You are the head. Please lead us, Lord, and direct us. Help us to be faithful in utilizing the gifts you've given us. Help us not to be overwhelmed. Help us not to be discouraged. And certainly help us not to be judgmental and critical. We just thank you for your grace and thank you for the church. In Jesus' name.
Silas, let me communicate that Pure Heart Vision, your elders have we've been talking and plan to do a pretty significant assessment of the congregation, and one piece of that will be going to this text and using a tool that I got several years ago from Silas that has been very useful to a lot of churches. Jim DeBose will be one of the consultants to assist in that project as well, but we'll be identifying various gifts of members of the congregation that come out of this very model and approach to Romans 12 that Silas has talked about. So,
I just want to thank you, Silas, for visiting Ralph Johnson, because I saw that display today. I ate an apple every day of that lectureship.